Ms. Leverins?
Here.
Mr. Polster?
Here.
Mr. Schmidt? I understand Mr. Schmidt will be joining us later. Mr. O'Connor is traveling for work and will not be able to join us this evening. Mr. Kropp?
Here.
Mr. Carter?
Here.
Mr. Carter is the Community Participation Chair and the representative on the Planning Commission Working Group. Mr. Haldeman?
Here.
Ms. Dowdy?
I'd like from time to time to accommodate anybody, any member of the public who wanted to make a short statement, but I don't see anybody here today. So we'll move on to new business, comprehensive plan update process. Again, Ms. Rosario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today's work session marks the first meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group, who, along with the Community Participation Team, helps lead the comprehensive plan review process. Although the bulk of this group's work will come toward the latter part of the process, this is an important opportunity to lay the foundation for that work. Glad, Leanne, and I will be leading the group through 4 main topics today, with an opportunity to discuss and get your input on each one along the way. We will review the comprehensive plan, update process and the Planning Commission Working Group's role, provide an overview of public engagement plan and branding, brief you on the scenario planning and modeling, and lead a discussion on issues and opportunities. As noted in the joint work session in July, everyone has a role to play in the comprehensive plan update. All along the way, we are looking to the citizens of James City County to give us input on the vision, goals, and policy direction to get us to the desired future of the county. To this end, the Community Participation Team has the primary responsibility for encouraging, facilitating, and reporting public engagement so that it can be used in the development of the plan. Mr. Carter, as the representative from the CPT, will help this body keep this input in mind. As Leanne will share with you in a few minutes, the CPT is fully underway and getting quite busy with this task. While this important work is going on, the planning team will meet with you periodically to review public engagement themes, to guide and monitor scenario planning and the modeling process, and to provide input to staff and the consultants, the planning team, for the plan analysis and technical work associated with the plan update. These are important responsibilities, but there are additional ones that will come more to light toward the later phases when the process will shift to developing policy and the reviewing of the draft plan. At this time, the Planning Commission Working Group will meet on a more frequent basis and will receive input from government agency partners such as the Service Authority, the Virginia Department of Transportation, and will recommend changes to the plan, including changes to the land use map. So that is just a brief overview of the process to reacclimate you and to outline the responsibilities of this body, especially in contrast to the Community Participation Team. That we pause at this moment and just see if there were any questions or comments. Great. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to Leanne. Oh, sorry. Vlad.
Thank you, Tammy. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the working group. Pleasure to be here again. Vlad Gavrilovic with EPR and joined by Leanne King with Clarion on the consultant team. And we'd like to kind of, as Tammy said, share with you some information on the overall plan and then some real deeper dive into the land use scenario planning and modeling and the public engagement. A lot of you were here in July 10th when we did the briefing with the Planning Commission and the board. Some of you weren't, but just kind of a couple of slides to talk about the overall process. So the relationship you see on the slide here of this process to the overall planning, if you will, process in the county. That wheel on the right says that we look at the comprehensive plan and other plans to set policy priorities. These are your long-term, typically 20, 25-year view ahead of what are the broad policies for change, preservation, growth, development, infrastructure, facilities, things like that. And then, of course, those will plug into the strategic plan, which is more of a 3 to 5 year time frame. As we complete this comprehensive plan, it'll probably be time for updating the strategic plan, so the policies will go into and inform the next strategic plan update. Then you have your annual budget process, your CIP, typically 5-year funding priority process, and then your individual implementation action plans on typically a yearly basis. So that's kind of the wheel of planning, if you will, and where the comprehensive plan fits in. And on the left are 4 specific recommendations from the strategic plan that this process implements. So it will look at the land use and fiscal impacts of large-scale land use changes over a long time frame, including things like fiscal infrastructure, community character, and environmental impacts of these land use changes, potential land use changes, as well as expanding the PSA, which was one of the priorities to look at in the strategic plan, at least to analyze. And part of that is refining the fiscal impact model to assess both short-term and long-term development impacts on the county's fiscal health, and of course, updating the comprehensive plan. So this is implementing several of those key priorities from the strategic plan. And then just to give you an overview again of the timeline of the process. So this is roughly a 2-year process with 5 phases to it. And what we've done here is highlight your meetings, or the big milestones of your meetings, if you will, in this process. And there's a note there in the lower right that says additional working group meetings may occur more frequently in phases 3, 4, and 5. And that recognizes that at the early part of this process, your role is to guide, be informed, updated on, and briefed on these early phases of the process. But as we shift towards actually having a draft plan and policy framework to review, you will take a much more hands-on role, and you'll have more frequent meetings to review that plan and provide key guidance on it. Just briefly on the phases, we're in phase 1 now, which is laying the foundation. We discuss things like your scope and roles, and we'll give you a briefing on the scenario planning. Part of this phase also is building that public engagement process that Leanne will share with you. As we go towards kind of the fall and winter, we get into the scenario and model building phase, and you'll see there is a key kind of public engagement and event or series of events in November, as well as the rollout of the website and other kind of engagement activities. And we'll have a briefing meeting with you somewhere in the January timeframe to give you a summary of the public input from those events and that we've received to date, as well as a update on kind of building these models. And we will also be kind of sharing with you the draft scenarios that we will get from the public input, these draft kind of future alternatives. And we'll want to get your review and kind of blessing on those, because right after that, we'll start building the models based on those scenarios. And we'll come back to the public in the summer of next year with presenting these 3 alternative futures of the county, how it could grow, along with their impacts in terms of these 3 models. And we'll get their input, public input, and we'll present this to you and get your affirmation with the public input on what is the future scenario sometime in the fall timeframe, future preferred scenario. So we'll narrow from these 3 alternate futures to a preferred one, and that in phase 4 is when we start building the draft plan. And then your kind of meetings get more frequent. We'll be presenting to you the draft policy framework. There's also some special studies that will be going on at that time. Going towards the phase 5 implementation with a full draft plan and all its elements, including implementation plan, and getting your kind of active input on those. And Tammy, please let me know if I missed anything, but that's a broad overview of the next 2 years of our work together. Okay, I'll turn it over to Leanne for the public engagement.
Thanks, Mike. So this will be a little bit of a reminder for several of you around the table that are part of the community participation team, but new information for those of you that aren't. So we've had 3 community participation team meetings thus far and have actually made some pretty good headway. And you'll see the fruits of your labor here in just a moment. Some of the key pieces that we've been working on are the public engagement and communications plan, which deals with how we're going to engage the community and what those phases are throughout the process, and some of the tools that we're going to use, and the communications piece. What are the different forms of reaching out and kind of engaging and communicating with the community? As part of that process, we established some engagement objectives that we want to be reflecting back upon throughout this process. That's part of the community participation team's charge is, we want to make sure we're achieving these objectives. And there are 2 slides here. This first one here describes the first 4, which are community members will be given the choice and access to engage in the planning process through multiple activities. So we want to have a lot of choices for people to engage. Educational opportunities will advance the community's understanding of critical planning issues. So we want this to be a process where we're kind of building not only our understanding of what the community's desires and aspirations are, but also helping them to build their understanding of the choices in front of them and some of the important information behind that. Public engagement efforts will seek to engage a diversity of residents that's representative of the community, and we want to be evaluating that at each step where we have major public engagement opportunities to make sure that who we're hearing from is representative of the community. Participants' opinions will be respected, well documented, and will help inform policy direction in the plan. So we want a level of transparency and clarity about, what information we've taken in. Verbatim responses from people will be documented so they can go and see that their information was taken. And we're going to be digesting it. We want to make sure we're asking questions that we're actually going to use the information to help inform a decision that we have to make in the process. Public engagement efforts will seek to inspire trust and continued interest and involvement in the process. We've had a lot of success in other communities, building that kind of inspiration and interest in the project. And part of that's due to the transparency. Part of it's try to have fun while we're working through some tough stuff together. Clear documentation, project publicity, and engagement activities will articulate how public inputs have been used to inform policy direction. Basically, that's saying that we're going to have, to the extent that we can, we're going to have a bread trail so that people can kind of understand where the decision points were and what the input was that led to those decision points and how that builds over the process. And then finally, community engagement will be record-breaking and surpass statistics of past planning efforts. We want to get more people involved in this process than we have in the past. Vlad shared with you the overall project framework, which has kind of everything soup to nuts included. This is kind of the 4 buckets that you see on the slide here really encapsulate the engagement component of the process and how we'll be kind of messaging that with the community. So there'll be 4 main periods of engagement. The first one's listen and envision. The second, explore and test, which related to the scenarios. Decide and affirm is where we're confirming policy direction, and then plan and implement, we're actually drafting and sharing the plan over time. And we'll have, on the project website, we'll have a graphic that kind of melds these 2 kind of key engagement and the larger framework together to help the layperson understand how this process is kind of unfolding. So the other piece that the community participation team has been working on is the branding for the process, which will help give it, a name and a visual identifier. And we had kind of a fun series of events that we did. We started off with branding in a word. And so at our first meeting, we collected several words that people wanted people to think of when they thought of the process. We took that and kind of played with it a little bit and came up with some options for the branding. And at the last meeting, we offered 3 different branding options. And so we did an activity to kind of get everybody's preferences among the 3. And luckily, we landed on one. We almost had a tie. And then right at the end, we had one kind of pull out. So it's Engage 2045, Share Your Ideas, Shape Our Community, James City County. And so this is what you'll be seeing on the project website and all of the related materials and presentations. You'll see this graphic, and hopefully people will start to call this process Engage 2045. That's the intention here. And the tagline was really something that everybody seemed to latch onto and really like, this idea of share your ideas, shape our community, that really expresses what we want to encourage people to do throughout the process.
You tweaked the graphic a little bit. It looks really nice.
Yeah,
It does. It looks great.
Good.
You nailed it.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll tell Holly.
Yes.
I didn't do it. Related to, so the branding can only say so much, right? It's a visual identifier and it sends a message, but it can't say everything. And so when we're doing kind of written communication about the project on the project website and other places, press releases, et cetera, we want to have some other key messages that we're sharing about the process to kind of make it a more complete message that we're sharing. And so these are the 4 key messages that we talk about with the community participation team. I think we had 5 and we kind of morphed them into 4. And so these are the Engage 2045 is the critical opportunity to shape our community's future and drive real action. This process will focus on educating residents and eliciting their opinions. So that's going to be a key focus to this. County leaders are listening and want to hear from you. So this is really something that's supported, from the top down. And all opinions and ideas will be considered and policy direction will be driven by community support. So those are the key messages that kind of help to inform the reader about what this process is, why it's important, a little more beyond just the actual logo. Any questions on the messaging or branding
Or I neglected to pause after the overall process slide, so maybe a good time to take a breath and get your questions or discussion on this.
I liked your breadcrumb metaphor. That
Yeah,
was,
I did. I like that too.
and that's an important step. I'm not sure we've ever directly linked the outcome with how we got there. So that's important.
I think that, one thing we can do as we go through each of these 4 phases is that we can kind of memorialize in the first phase, this is, these are the key outcomes of what we learned from this phase, and we carry that through. And then the next time we memorialize what we learned from that phase, and that builds off so that when we go to the end, you can have, here are the 4 phases, and here's what we learned along the way that kind of builds,
And I assume the county website, the comp plan link is going to periodically update with that sort of information, and so people can go back and see the breadcrumbs as well.
Right. Yeah, and we might have, that's a good point, we could have some simple messages, but then we'll also have the more kind of robust reports that will be done kind of each phase that will document the details. But we might want to think about how we want on the website to kind of share those key messages about the progress. And
I like the idea of the simple message, because some of the links that Alex sent for other comprehensive plans for other states and localities, I personally thought it was very effective to get the higher level executive summary bullets, and then let the people, if I remember right, like a particular bullet, you could click on and get a more detailed explanation on that. And I think it's going to be very important to not alienate folks with a ton of information, but to let them sort of dive as deep as they want to into that. I think that'll facilitate community involvement. Just let everybody decide how much of the information they want to dig into.
Yeah, the kind of the cocktail speech almost of kind of each phase and what we've accomplished and
Exactly.
learned. Yeah.
It's particularly important with the modeling too, I think, because some of it will get pretty technical, so having always a clear summary
Yes.
of what it means.
I think that's important.
This question may be for Paul, but on the strategic plan piece and your reference to the operational initiatives that were there, those are really part of your RFP that feed your modeling piece. It's not your intent coming up to the 2-year cycle for budgeting to use any of this for the strategic plan update to influence the budget at all, is it?
No,
Okay.
it's all going towards this.
Okay, but I would say, though, for those folks that did go through the strategic planning piece and wondering why we're doing this all over again, the same questions that you got the last time, I think being clear about that connection and how that's going to impact the process, especially with the model, those become outputs as opposed to let's go try this, I think would be important for people to understand.
One of the things that we're going to do on the project website is speak directly to the relationship between the comprehensive plan and the strategic plan. So that can be a resource for the community participation team and anyone who's kind of reading about the project or has a question. We can direct them there if we need to have some, guidance about how to respond to that question.
Well, just as a follow-on, just the idea that when you look at your survey, and just as an example, the one that I picked is the rural land piece in that gap. Specifically, those modeling pieces are going to help feed that. For example, the idea of the PSA and what you do with that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's some input associated with the relook at the PSA as it applies to the rural side, as well as there's a couple other things in there I think that apply. But that kind of connectivity, I think, will help people to engage with their opinions about that.
There will be definitely some spatial components of the modeling, and so people can see if you happen to change in this way or grow in this way, here's some of the impacts. So yeah, that's a really good point. You haven't always had that ability to see what's the impact of this pattern of growth.
Right. And so we may revisit past decisions in that regard.
Do you have, not to digress, do you have software that shows impacts? I'm thinking eons ago, there was this game called SimCity that you could build, the software and show what happens if you put a shopping center here and the level of service on the roadways will be affected and so on and so forth. And so you have a modeling tool that will actually say
and we'll look a little bit at, it's called Community Viz, the modeling that we're using for land use, and then there's other models for fiscal and for traffic. But we'll show a little bit of how that works.
Oh, that'll be neat. Yeah.
On the last talking point, I think it's the previous slide, where we talk about policy direction will be driven by community support. We had some discussion about this at one of the community participation team meetings about not giving the impression that the public's input is going to be reflected absolutely in the policies.
So go back and just check that
just
language.
Go back and check that, because I'm not sure that even the word support would be appropriate, but certainly input. But the word driven also could imply that, because there are going to be lots of people with lots of different input. Mm-hmm. And so what this person says may be 180 degrees from what this person says. We're not going to be able to do both.
That will happen.
Perhaps informed rather than driven type thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's sort of where we ended up in the meeting.
That may just have gotten left off. So we can definitely go back and check on that. Great. Move to the
and we're doing well on time. So we have kind of a little deeper dive into the scenario planning, and then we have some time to really ask you some questions about opportunities and ideas for as we go forward. So this is a little bit of a look under the hood of the scenario planning and modeling without getting into too much detail, but it's important to kind of build your knowledge base and the public's knowledge base about how we're conducting the scenario planning process in this. So we're going to share some of the things about the issues and data and approach. This is a slide we showed in the Board Planning Commission briefing, but it's basically an overview of how the scenario planning process works. And it's why this is not your average comprehensive plan, which might take one forecast and try to plan for that forecast. So this is taking on the left that idea that you have uncertainty about which way the future is going to go in terms of demographics and economy and energy and Lord knows all these other factors, and organizing those potential future outcomes into discrete alternate land use scenarios, ways that the county might accommodate this forecasted projected growth in a certain time frame. And then putting those three land use scenarios into the middle of this testing. Land use testing, cumulative impacts testing, which is includes your public facilities, parks and rec, fire stations, police, things like that, as well as transportation. what the future transportation impacts will be. And then fiscal impact, especially looking at what's the impact of these different growth scenarios on the county's kind of fiscal bottom line. All of those will have outputs. It'll be almost like science experiments with data resulting from each one of those. We will do this in the public eye transparently, so the public will be able to see the impacts of these scenarios and the models, and work with them and with stakeholders and you all to kind of find a preferred future land use framework. And that will be used to kind of build the comprehensive plan element by element based on that informed decision-making process. And you see that arrow at the bottom, which is part of our contract, is to also have leave-behind versions of all of these models so that it can be used for ongoing planning processes by the county. And this is highlights that. So there's two types of models that we're building in this. The big picture model that looks ahead 25 years for scenario planning and really engages the public in exploring and envisioning different futures and what their impacts might be, versus things that will leave behind models that will be usable by county staff for strategic planning, for planning for parks and rec, transportation, fire, police, things like that, and also assessing development impacts. You'll see some examples of how this can be used to look at the fiscal impacts of development proposals, for example. So this is just a summary of these three models, noting that each one will have a series of indicators, metrics, if you will. So for example, one of the things that the strategic plan wanted the comprehensive plan to look at was the impacts on community character, the impacts on environment, fiscal impacts, things like that. Want to put all that into a comprehensive dashboard that allows the public to see what the impact of these scenarios are, allows decision makers to make informed policy decisions. And now I'm going to go through each model a little bit just to show kind of how this software works. So one of the things about the land use model is we start with control totals for population and employment. In order to be an apples to apples comparison, this will not look at different rates of growth or different control totals for growth. So it won't look at a high, medium, low growth scenario. Instead, what it does is look at a set amount of growth, population, and employment over a certain time period, and then compare what are the fiscal, environmental, land use, all these other impacts, transportation impacts, based on different ways that that growth could be accommodated, different patterns of growth. And this will be done through place types. I'll show you that in a minute, but basically the types of land uses or place types arranged on the county map according to different suitabilities. And these are things that drive kind of this scenario. So a scenario might be more growth around existing centers of activity or more dispersed growth or things like that. And suitability factors will drive the model to portray those different scenarios on the land. And then you see that little growth allocator. That's actually the model telling how to allocate this growth based on that scenario. Once we get that kind of allocation, it'll go into these different models of fiscal impact, cumulative impact, transportation modeling. So we'll have the results of that. And we'll also have a series of indicators down at the bottom just for the land use, environmental, community character results for each scenario. So it's a robust process with a lot of data, but we're going to try and present all that data in kind of easy, user-friendly charts and graphs and statistics.
Can you tell us, sort of by example, what the suitability factors are?
I got a slide that gives how they will work. It's the slide after this, I believe. Before I do that, though, so this model is going to basically, rather than land uses, these are place types. And one of the advantages we have here is having this regional model from Hampton Roads TPO that has already built in place types that James City County has been part of the process in developing this regional model and has ensured that these place types are consistent with their comprehensive plan, with your comprehensive plan categories. And then there is a 2045 version of this that is consistent with your comprehensive plan. So that will become our baseline of the business as usual, or the baseline, if you will, scenario of what 2045 growth will be. And the reason we're using the place types from the regional land use model is so that we can use the regional travel demand model to model transportation impacts. That's a real plus rather than trying to create a from scratch transportation model. So these are the 21. They capture the types of land uses fairly well, and we'll be building kind of the storyline behind each one of these as we go and what the densities and intensities are.
Tammy tried to school me on the travel piece from the last comprehensive plan. And one of the things that she caught me in that is that the county has been updating that model so that the granularity of what it takes to go from a place to another is more finite as opposed to broad. So at this point, how granular is that model? And what is the relationship to the reality of what the transportation looks like now and may look like?
I can answer that to some extent. So the final 2045 model has not been delivered yet from VDOT. We expect it in about 2 weeks. First task will be an assessment of things like the granularity of that model and how well it works at a county level. So it's a matter of taking that region-wide model and adding some tweaks to it to make sure it accurately portrays transportation at the county level. And part of that may be adding transportation analysis zones, TAZs, that give you more granularity so that it is reflective of the county.
Right. What I'm thinking about is that we ended up approving a Wawa station for population growth in York County that was going to jam an intersection with no alternative. And we're getting ready to widen Croker Road. So those are the sort of impacts I think we're interested in. Some of us think there's nothing else you can do about it, but I think I'm positive that you may be able to offer something, hopefully, if it's granular enough.
It will be much more accurate than you've ever had before for travel demand modeling.
Okay.
Oh, you have.
Could you go back one slide, please? The starting point, the control totals for population and employment, where do you get that? And how do you make it grow? Or
Yes, exactly. So the control, if we want to use the travel demand model to model transportation, we need to use their control totals for 2045.
Who's there? TPOs?
The TPOs, okay. Basically, the TPO forecast. Okay. And they're, you can pick different forecasts. There's a statewide forecast, there's a regional forecast, there's a straight line forecast. In our experience with modeling, it's not so much which forecast you pick, just so that you have the same one for each scenario so that you can compare apples to apples.
Gotcha. Okay.
To that point, though, the Weldon Cooper guys who do most of this work, they sit on the number of parcels that are still not developed. What is that criteria for this model?
That would be done by the HRPDC and their demographers, and I'm not sure exactly. They did birth rates, death rates, natural growth, immigration, things like that to develop their model. And I think it's less than, when you look at the projections, it's less than the Weldon Cooper, but more than the straight line projection of growth. So it's somewhere in the middle.
But fundamental to that is they look at each of the counties and they look at the available parcels, and then they do a multiplication by 245 or whatever it is to come up with that population growth over time. I mean, it's kind of fundamental to their methodology, and I'm just wondering whether or not you're deviating or coming up with something else.
We're not going to be using the Weldon Cooper because we need to use what's baked into the travel demand model.
We don't know. You don't know what they're using.
We do know what their numbers are, but we can get you documentation on how they got there too, because they have it all very well done.
I think it's a valid question to know what the assumptions are that you're using for that.
It's a good point, and we should probably build that into the documentation on the website. Is where does this come from, and provide links to their documentation for it.
But you're going to run the scenario with one number so that you have apples to apples. Are you going to change that number and run another scenario?
No, the scenarios will be about where growth can happen and what it'll do to transportation and environment, all these things, not about whether you have more growth or less growth. So we're not going to change that number or
Okay.
scenario by scenario. And the reason you do that is because then you're not really measuring the impacts of policies. It's more like you're measuring the impacts of, well, what if growth doesn't happen at this level or that level? And what we found is that if you can't predict when you'll reach a certain threshold, but you can analyze for that threshold. Whether you reach that threshold in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, you're still providing a consistent analysis of that threshold of growth.
I don't mean to beat this one to death, but I think there needs to be the apples to apples, for example, for the modeling work that was done on water for the county that goes out to 2060. And it estimates an amount that's needed. And that was based on the Weldon Cooper population growth numbers. And so if we're going to have comparisons for the cumulative impact, of which water is going to be one of them, that starting point at least has to be true for every one of those.
Good point. And we'll definitely look into that. Again, we have some limitations. If we want to get the outputs out of it, we have to use the HRTPO model inputs. We can vary some of the assumptions of those inputs, like the densities of different place types and things like that, but the overall control totals we have to keep constant.
Maybe I'll see that when we talk about the suitability factor.
Yeah, let me share how we're going to modify the scenarios based on those. So this is how the model, again, it's community-biz software. We're actually working on this in a regional model for the whole Hampton Roads region. But the guts of it, if you look on the left, there's a series of drivers that help kind of define each scenario. And I don't know, the fine print matters much there, but for example, economic drivers could be things like there's a greater growth in knowledge-based industries, and that will tend to favor certain place types, like mixed use. Knowledge industries favor mixed use. There could be a more retirement population or things like that that might favor or other place types like low-density residential. And so these drivers, scenario drivers, will influence suitability by place type across the top there. And it'll tell the model which place types to favor and put more growth in. And then there's another type of suitability by spatial attractor. And those could be things like the scenario might say, put more growth where along the waterfront is one that we're doing in the regional model. It could say, put more growth where there is an existing center of activity, cultural tourist attractions. It could also be detractors, like growth near 64 is a detractor, so put growth away from that. But the model basically takes these two types of suitability and comes up with a composite suitability map, which you see there in the center. And this is dark red is the highest attractiveness to growth, and yellow is the lower attractiveness to growth. And then there's an automated kind of allocator, computer-driven allocator in the model that allocates that growth. So this is very important that, we are not, as the consultants, saying growth happens here or there. The model itself is saying growth is being sent here based on the scenario narrative. So we'll be walking through all these steps with you in detail. This will all be available on the website. We won't necessarily go through every detail with the public just because of the time involvement, but it'll all be visible on the website and transparent. So that's the land use model. That's probably the most complex one of these. But just to kind of highlight next steps in the process, we're building these data sets in the fall. We will be presenting in November. We'll be engaging the public in November in a series of events, and we hope to use some of that input to actually craft these 3 scenarios and some of these drivers of what drives these scenarios. And then we'll be building those scenarios in the spring. As I mentioned, we'll come back to you in January kind of with some ideas for those draft scenarios. We'll be testing them in the spring and summer, along with the other models that will also be testing these scenarios. And then we'll hope to have a preferred land use plan based on public and stakeholder input by the fall. So that's the land use model, and now a little information on fiscal and transportation. So some of the features the fiscal impact models do improves one's ability to evaluate the fiscal impacts of land use decisions, infrastructure projects, policy choices. It's a very flexible kind of spreadsheet-based model that you can plug in different scenarios for land use, infrastructure, or policy and see what the fiscal impacts would be, which provides information to the staff and decision makers, and it allows you to plan for future capital needs and as well as operating impacts based on the kind of fiscal balance of the county and its ability to absorb these capital needs. As I said, there's 2 model options. So one is this cumulative impact model that is looking long range, used for scenario planning, and it's going to evaluate the fiscal impacts of growth under these long-term 25-year scenarios, as well as the project level model that is smaller scale and shorter time frame. So this will allow you to evaluate fiscal impacts of specific development proposals, including providing input into proffer discussions, because it will give you kind of the kind of net fiscal balance of different development proposals. All of them will address operating as well as capital costs. That's one of the key features of this. So it's not just you can build a rec center, it's also how much it costs to operate that rec center. They'll allow comparing different assumptions for property values, timing of development, land uses. One important thing is that the fiscal impact models do require annual updates. So when there's changes to the budget factors, changes to the demographics, fairly simple updates, but they're not static. They need to be updated every year. And then here's some examples. This is from Tischler Bice, our fiscal impact consultant. So this is an example of how you do some of these projections, 20-year projections in this case, for different types of capital needs. And you can see the categories: parks and rec, fire, police, library, streets, things like that. And these get plugged into basically their kind of net fiscal impact on the county. The Tischler Bice will be working with county departments in the coming month or so to talk about level of service standards for these different capital needs and kind of existing conditions, and then planning for the future. Yeah,
Just a little tangent mostly for Paul and Tammy, but that project-based cumulative impact model that you were talking about could be used for proffer discussions and so on and so forth. Do you anticipate that this is something that would be available to developers when they're submitting either rezonings or SUPs? And what I'm getting at is, we oftentimes hear that the developers complain that the fiscal impact formulas worksheet that they have to fill out isn't accurate from their standpoint for their project. And I was just wondering if this is a potential opportunity so that everybody is using the same modeling techniques. But again, this is just a little tangent, but I just wanted to get that out there because we have heard those comments from applicants in the past.
When I think of cumulative impact, I've got the fiscal piece. I definitely got the transportation piece and the impact on the services. But I also think about the impact on the environment. Where is that in this scenario or modeling as a factor? And how are you going to do that?
Yeah, Part of that will be built into the Community Viz land use model. So it has a lot of environmental outputs, if you will, that are already built into it based on the place type assumptions and the growth assumptions. So it'll give you things like acreage consumed by type of land. It'll give you things like the water usage, sewer impacts, air quality impacts, based on these kind of formulas built into it, which you can change the assumptions, but like what's the impact of a typical house or a commercial development or things like that on environmental impacts.
Let me take that a little further, because I think what I'm thinking about is this notion about land use in the rural areas. And so if you were going to look at it, I understood that one of the things that you guys were going to do was take a look at the application of the AFD, PDR, and TDR programs on land use in the rural areas. And so it seems to me that if you were going to at least meet up with this notion that we're not doing enough for the rural area, that we want to still continue with the current environment that we're in quality of life, there's some limitations that you would want to put into that model for conservation or environmental reasons. So how is it that you're going to be able to assess that sort of cumulative impact, or the decision not to, or in fact put money into those programs based on your model for growth?
I see. If I understand your question, we'll say two parts, I think, to your question. One is just how we're going to assess things like the community character or the impact on farmland and things like that. Some of those are going to have to be off-model analysis things, because Community Viz won't give you that automatically. So that's part of our charge as a consultant team, is to come up with ways that we can assess the impacts to things like community character from these different scenarios. But the other part of your question is, I don't think more an assessment or an output question. It's more like, what do we build into the scenarios? So one of the scenarios could say things like, what if we really don't have any growth in the rural areas? And one of the scenarios could be like, what if there's some limited growth in rural areas or things like that? So those are different scenarios, and then what the model will do is tell you what's the fiscal impact on that, what's the environmental, community character, all those things. Is that what you were getting at?
Well, yeah, and I'm very interested in how you're going to do that. I think Tammy will tell you that she's been involved in something called the Lower Chickahominy Study that's looked at an economic analysis that says it's better to conserve land. And so that approach and the modeling to those areas of conservation land within that. So you come up with this idea that you may invest $1 in something and get back economic of $1.53. And so that could be a rationale for conservation of PDR or TDR, or in fact to continue with the AFD in some areas because you want to limit the growth outside of those areas and keep it within there, and therefore reward it as an example.
Good point. And your examples are implementation techniques, so AFD or PDR, but the model would at least tell you,
spit it out,
give you ammunition for why you would want to do those.
Because most of what I've seen so far is really growth-based. And so for us that don't want any damn growth, all I'm going to get is growth in this model for it. And so one of the scenarios that I'm looking for is what happens if you restrict the PDR area? And what's the impact of that? Or if you look at areas, for example, the economic opportunity in the Hillcrest Moortown Road that's in the EO, and you took that out, what would be the impact of that?
Yeah.
Those sort of things. So I'm trying to figure out whether the model in the scenarios is going to accommodate and give us something factual.
In a broad sense, yes. Now, I don't see, a specific parcel of land and saying, we're going to test what if this parcel develops and then retest it again, what if that parcel doesn't develop. But as a broad sense of the pattern here is one of this type of growth versus that type of growth, yes, it will tell you which one is better from many different perspectives.
Yeah, maybe I misunderstood the suitability factor of the terrain itself. And so if I'm inputting an EOMU into your model, I'm going to get an answer that says go to that area. But if I take out that area, I'm going to get a different answer for that I am interested in.
Yes, you can build in no-build areas, You can make them the same for every scenario, or you can say this scenario has another type of no-build. Yep. A lot of flexibility.
So I'm apologize. I'm obviously a little late to the game. But along those lines with build out and modeling, I'm coming off the commission next year, unfortunately. So this is maybe my only meeting with this group here. Hello, Mr. Carter. Good to see you again. And I just want to get it out there that it would be awesome to see our municipality try to strive for clean energy, to make a commitment to that. And that doesn't mean all the energy is produced that's clean within the county. It can come from elsewhere, offshore, turbines, whatever. But in the modeling with our rural areas, we're starting to see some applicants coming to us interested in putting solar farms actually within one is A1, so one's outside the PSA, but one was inside. Nonetheless, that's something I'd be very interested in. Modeling for, I don't know if that's in your system, but solar farms, because I think we've all talked about this. I mean, it's a great way, if we can control the runoff, it's a great way to get the clean energy, but not only that, to curtail some of the development pressure. And would you rather have driving, through your neighborhood, 1,000 extra cars or just a few people working on that solar plant that's back there, So I don't know, just wanted to get that out there.
Good point. And that might be a very good example of these leave behind models where the county will be able to do special studies and special modeling assessments of, one land use or one small area or things like that. There's a lot of flexibility in it.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is continuing on the fiscal impact. This is, I think, a good example of how the model can look at things like capital and operating expenditures. So the red area is your capital expenditures, the lighter red is operating expenditures, and the green is your revenue stream over a number of years. And so, it doesn't just look at, this is how much it costs to build a rec center. It's how much does it cost to operate a rec center and how those things will change over time. And then these are some project level example outputs. You can see that these are over time. So it's like a 20-year time frame. But even this can have different scenarios, like you can test different build-out rates on a project or different land use mixes on a project. In a sense, everything you do at the county-wide scale over 25 years, you can do on an individual project scale too.
Is Grace Boone's study work feeding into this?
I would have to ask Tischler Weiss. I don't know.
Grace is doing, go ahead.
We are connecting Grace with Julie and talking about ways to either use that existing data or to take it to the next level so that we might be able to integrate it more into modeling.
The modeling scenario that they're going to create is going to give you the same kind of an output in terms of future growth, and especially with the operating revenue cost to the existing. So for the very first time, we're going to have essentially a 10-year CIP for both schools and for the county, which seems to me to be the baseline for the modeling. I don't know where you're getting that data.
That seems like they need to really talk to each other, yeah. Good point.
Because they're talking about a scenario in there of consolidating all of the government facilities. And one of the outputs of that work is, here's what you can do, and where you should do it and when, based on what the state of all your other facilities are, and what's the cost breakover for being able to do that.
Yeah, so this is, we're not going to do any project level modeling as part of this, but this will allow you to do that. So in building that model, they should look at kind of how that other modeling work is being done. Okay. All right, so next steps in this process are similar to the land use. There's a series of interviews with different departments, talk about level of service and kind of baseline data over the next month, analyzing the data in November, and then developing this countywide model by the first of the year so that it can plug into testing the scenarios in the spring. And then the project level model shortly thereafter, spring and summer, are testing those land use scenarios for fiscal impacts. And the last one is the travel demand model, and this is being handled by Michael Baker. So I'm going to do my best on kind of explaining the ins and outs of this, but you'll be hearing more from them as we go through this process. You probably know the various uses of travel models. We can, on a regional level, we do things like air quality conformity and congestion management. This is probably in the area of long-range planning because we're looking at 25-year time frame and what are the transportation impacts. It can also be done for small area things.
What does CHIP mean?
Transportation Improvement Program. That's typically something you do at the regional level. There's certain things that the travel demand model tells you or analyzes. How many trips there are, that's based on the types of land uses. Where are they going? What mode? Are they car or transit? And there is a transit piece to this model, transit element to this. And then assignment of which roadways they're taking. And what we get out of them will be things like traffic volumes by road and, of course, the transit segment. The average times or speeds, that helps us look at congestion. Vehicle miles of travel is a good way of comparing scenarios. So we can have one scenario that might have a lot of more overall travel than another one. Typically, compact development gives you a lot less travel. It has air quality impacts. It has congestion impacts. So that's like a good benchmark. And that gives you auto emissions and then various types of performance measures, how much you're encouraging transit use versus automobile use and things like that. These are some sample outputs. So this is actually comparing scenarios. The yellow bar is what if traffic could go free flow and could go the speed limit. And then the other colored bars are different alternative land uses that have different impacts on transportation. And these are assigned to different types of roads. So you can do it on an individual road or you can do it on a category of road. Oops. This is just some outputs from an earlier version of the regional model, looking at the impacts by functional class. That's a type of roadway, collector, arterial. Looking at the average daily traffic links. That map on the upper right is kind of a heat map of congestion, if you will, or sorry, a heat map of traffic volumes, not necessarily congestion, although that can be mapped too. And the one on the lower right is more congestion, where green is kind of free flow and different versions of orange are more congestion. So we'll have these types of capabilities and outputs for the county, not just the region. And then the time frame of this, similar to the other models, we expect VDOT to give us the regional model in mid-October, in a couple of weeks. We'll be analyzing that model and creating this county version of it as a base year model by the end of the year. And then the base year model will be the kind of current way traffic performs. And then developing that 2045 model shortly thereafter. Again, timed for a spring-summer deployment of the travel demand model so it can analyze those scenarios and give the traffic impacts on them. So that's, I think, again, as I said, a look under the hood of these different models. We'll be sharing more as we come back to you and as you see these scenarios. And before turning it back to you and with some questions, just want to kind of talk about next steps and the immediate horizon. So in the coming month, we'll be continuing with these CPT meetings. We'll be launching the website. We'll be launching various public engagement activities, building to this November series of events with a public forum, a public summit. And tied to that will be questionnaires on the website. We're looking at doing things like the visual preference survey on a website as well as in the meetings to get people's inputs on community character. And then we'll start building the models once we have some input from that public engagement on the types of scenarios. over the holidays, we'll start building the alternate scenarios, come back to you in January with the results of the public input to date and some alternate scenarios to look at and get your blessing on those so we can build those in the spring. So any overall questions on kind of this, all the technical jargon?
I would have really appreciated being able to see some of the slides. There's some read-ahead materials beforehand. So for some of the other meetings, having that kind of material can maybe stop some of my dumb questions.
It's a good point. And we can, you know, for future briefings and things like that, give it to you ahead of time. We can start feeding the website with these materials and have them available there. But very good point. So I think we're doing well with time, but I wanted to kind of turn it back to you with some opportunity to talk about big picture issues and opportunities.
Yeah. So, you know, a lot of times when we start off a planning process like this, we tend to kind of talk about what are the issues, what are the kind of challenges, those types of things. But we wanted to pose maybe a kind of different type of question and maybe switch our brain a little bit from thinking about the stuff we think of on a day-to-day basis and getting us thinking about long-term and what the opportunities are for James City County. And so that's the question that we were hoping to just do a round robin, you know, discussion with you all to get some of your thoughts. You have a unique perspective from where you sit and kind of you're seeing current development applications, but also getting to think about the long term as part of this. You know, what do you think are the big ideas or opportunities that this process should be exploring or potentially advancing that you think are really kind of important for us to hear in an early stage of this process so that we can be factoring that in as we think about public engagement and kind of testing ideas with the community?
I'll start off. As you well know, out of the strategic plan, the number one issue was water. And if you look at the current study out of the JCSA, their projection for 2060 is the need for 16 million gallons a day. And I believe that we have missed the boat in being able to take advantage of the HRSD SWIFT project, which was the injection into the well. And our permit is up in 2027. So the notion of us being able to take groundwater out seems to me to be less unless we start doing something about that. And I look at that as probably the largest inhibitor to any kind of growth within the county, in that given the build-out rate that we have as by right, the water that we currently have is essentially spoken for. And so as a limitation, looking at scenarios beyond 2027 without thinking about water is fruitless in any of your scenarios, in my view. So the water issue, I think, is still, as it was 3 years ago or 4 years ago, still the number one issue. Mm-hmm. And all the rest of what you're going to do falls out from that without assumption.
If I can just want to state back one thing to make sure I heard you correctly. So it sounded like you were saying by right potential that exists today.
11,000 by right houses.
Would essentially use up all of the remaining
of the 8 million gallons that you get on your current permit. It uses all of that water, given the rate of build out.
Right.
Okay, and that's not mine. That comes out of the study. So you can see where you can see in their study the growth rate on water and connection, which is what's driving their numbers. So from my point of view, whether or not I'm right about that or not, that's neither here nor there. That's up to you to figure out in terms of melding those two models together,
right,
as a foundation one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And don't our water levels go down even more likely unless we find an alternative?
Right.
The
so
next,
you're into buying water from Newport News at a rate that is higher which is an impact on all the rest of those impact pieces of growth that you've talked about. Okay, and so there's some known figures already for that based on those alternatives. But once again, that to me is the key driver in any of this.
And the likelihood of us having an answer to the water issue within the next 6 to 9 months, a year is probably unlikely.
Zero.
Yeah. So we have to kind of deal with that unknown.
Yeah. Right. It's part of what you're talking about. The world's not complicated. It's complex with a lot of ambiguities in it. And so what those scenarios are, how they want to play out, you couldn't go to the board and ask them for an answer anytime soon. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't know. No.
So it seems like understanding what the development constraints look like, the comparison seems like an important thing to understand.
I think it's a real good point. We've definitely heard it when we did kind of interviews with department heads. Those constraints and those what ifs for the future of water. And I guess I'd say two things. One is just the caution of overemphasizing the time frame. You know, if we use 2045 as a time frame for the modeling, that doesn't mean that we're presupposing that this level of development or growth or whatever would happen in the year 2045. It is just a baseline to allow comparisons. You could adjust it to 2025 or whatever. It is useful to go further out because you get more data to work with in the models. But we've often had these types of issues where there's no sewer capacity beyond 10 years or something like that. So why should we even model beyond 10 years? I guess my answer to that is, as a form of analysis, it's still valid because it gives you information that you can use to make decisions today by having projected this and craft a better path to get there. And I'm sorry, the other thing is we definitely need to take this into account. So we don't know how yet, but somehow in the cost side, fiscal impacts, we may have some scenarios of different approaches to that we can analyze. So we won't ignore it. We'll need to take it into account.
I would hope you'd use it in the scenario side of the house for the land use piece, because that starts off with then what falls out from the rest. If you put in the cumulative impact, it's just a variable for cost.
Good point.
I think the single most important factor in this comprehensive plan and the single greatest threat to the long-term viability of James City County is land use conservation, open space preservation. It's been stated as a goal in the last two comprehensive plans, but ignored, and to great effect, negative effect already. Water is a symptom, not a cause, in my opinion. Traffic is a symptom, not a cause. The loss of business at Colonial Williamsburg is a symptom, not a cause. But I think our inability, or the inability of our economic development, is a symptom. Another symptom, in my opinion. We haven't done it. We're great at attracting McDonald's restaurants and wax museums. Not so good about well-paying tech jobs. There are other issues to that too, but I honestly believe the degradation of the local vistas and rural and historic ambiance, which is really all we have to offer, is the primary problem in James City County. And I'm prone to histrionics and when I come to this, but I honestly believe our fiscal and economic future depends on getting a grip on this somehow. We have by right development already in the pipelines due to very poor prior land use planning. What to do about that PDR maybe, or TDR, or something. But something has to be done about this, or there won't be a 2045 for James City County, in my opinion.
I want to follow up on that. I don't think I've told those of you who I've served with on the Planning Commission this before, but I know many of you know where I've worked for the last 26 years on Jamestown Island as an archaeologist. I have how many thousands upon thousands of visitors I've spoken to. And I've noticed a trend, and I hear this more and more, that from the visitors who've been coming for decades, that we used to love to be kind of driving through the farms, driving through the forest, and then boom, there we were in Colonial Williamsburg, or there we were on Jamestown Island, or there we were at Yorktown. But now we drive through, past all the McDonald's. We drive through, the giant mini golf. So there's just something is happening on our periphery that is potentially impacting our historic visitation. I think you're, absolutely onto something.
I want to echo the comments that have been made, because I do agree, and I think the issue of the PSA is significant as far as, there's been examples over the past few years since the last comp plan of bringing almost 200 acres into the PSA that was previously agricultural, and it would be very helpful to me to have some sort of tool. Redrawing the PSA probably realistically may not be feasible, only because what do you do if an area that's inside the PSA is drawn out of the PSA because the growth didn't materialize there? Certainly if there was no infrastructure on that property, it's a little easier to pull it out of the PSA, but there may be ramifications for property owners. And so I don't know how you get a handle on this, but I think, to Jack's point too, and it's reinforced with all of the citizen surveys for every comp plan, go back how many generations of comp plans, that the rural character of this county is a huge factor for people. 84% thereabouts is what the support for that is. The other area, and I guess there's some sort of relationship, but last comp plan, we came up with the land use designation of economic opportunity. And the vision was that residential component would be less than 20%, I believe. The vision was also that it would be public-private partnerships. There's two major tracks that I'm thinking of right now that are EO, but it would be helpful to look at some scenarios, looking at these tracks of what can realistically go in there. And I've commented before that I think our county is too dependent on hospitality and tourism and service industries. And I believe it was Jack or Danny that had mentioned we need to bring in more professionals. And so are there some strategies that we could use to do that with an EO zone? And how do you go about, are there examples out there in other communities and states and jurisdictions where they have successfully done something like this? And how do you go about it? I mean, that might be a series of goals, strategies, and actions to revitalize the EO area. And so those are sort of the issues, and of course water goes without saying.
I'm a member of both their fan clubs and their choirs for the growth thing and the environment thing. But I've taken a different approach that almost sounds like an implementation. And it starts with the notion of what is it you're trying to protect? And then what are the policies that you're after? And so in the example that Rich was talking about, I referenced it on the Moortown Hillcrest Farm. The EO specifications for that are light industry with mixed use with limited residential, light residential. That's the last goddamn thing we need with 3 farms that have been there for years and years. And so the only thing that's stopping it is there isn't a road that's going to go through that to be able to develop. But as soon as that land is master planned, it gets put into the PSA a priori. That's a scenario that I don't think we want to see happen.
And this is where the modeling would be helpful to see.
Which is why the traffic issue and your modeling pieces. So we may come back and revisit that decision that was done in 2009 and say enough. So what is the basis of analytical basis of doing something like that? Yeah. The second piece that I was talking about, and it's back to what are we trying to preserve in the rural lands? The governor has come up with a program that's taken the entire state and it's looked at the habitat of the state and it's rated it. And there was an allusion in Tammy's note at the board supervisors of using that as part of the modeling. And so if in fact there are sections of this county which are outstanding, both from an environmental point of view, and there happens to be that if you do preserve it and conserve it, there's an economic benefit to the county, what are the analytics that say that that makes sense to this notion of the rural character and the character of the community? And those are things that may sound like an implementation, but if the model can't help us to do that, we'll never get to the issue of what is it that we're really trying to protect, except a bunch of fuzzy, subjective sort of notions. And if your model can't give us some kind of quantitative and qualitative ideas for that, we don't know whether or not you should or shouldn't do whatever in the rural area, except we all know that we don't think you should.
Right. Well, we spent, I mean, oh, go ahead, Linda.
No, I was going to say, in regards to the model, are there things that I know once, and thank you for all the work that you've done so far. This is a huge learning experience for me as I'm new to the commission. But are there things that just are just common sense or will come from the studies that you do with citizens that just cannot, the model will just not give us answers on? Because we're saying a lot of things that make a lot of sense, but it's not necessarily something that you can type it, put it into that model, and it'll shoot out, you know.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it goes back to Mr. Polar's comment that there's qualitative and quantitative aspects of the model. So there's things that, like the visitor experience value of driving through the countryside to get to Jamestown Island, which is hard to put a dollar amount to. But we do have community survey results that say what people value, and that we can say these are the qualitative things that the community has said that they value, and here's the potential impacts on those qualitatively. And then there are quantitative things that we can say, here's the impact on farmland, here's the impact on wetlands or areas near wetlands. We will look into this thing of habitats, anything that we can actually quantify. And a lot of what you're talking about are kind of implementation techniques, which definitely is the whole latter part of this process, and we'll get into that. But it's also very valuable information for us in how we build these scenarios and what kind of data outputs you will need to assess them, to say this one performs better than the other.
I got a new one. And I think in part of the COP update, there is a requirement to look at resiliency and sea level rise on this thing. And so what I'm hoping you'll be able to do in your modeling is to be able to not just take the floodplain data, but start to take a look at the impacts of climate change in terms of increases in rain and the impact on the infrastructure. So we already know within the county areas that are experiencing more flooding to the infrastructure of the county. And so in 2012, there is a armoring of News Road in the CIP program to help against the Powhatan watershed, which is getting more flooding. And it's impacting in Ford's Colony, and it's impacting in Governor's Landing, and it's impacting downstream from there. We already know that the road between, if you're talking about getting to Jamestown, we already know that the Jamestown Road across the Powhatan, when it floods or a hurricane, it floods out 1607 and will impact other areas within the county.
Yep.
Period. We know those things.
Chickahominy Haven goes under.
Exactly. So, and there is some great work that I suggested to this committee before about using the VIMS folks for the modeling of that work. And I don't know if you've been able to contact them, but they have done work for other comp plans in the area to be able to apply their analytics and their modeling to it. And it will apply also to the lower Chickahominy and the wetlands in those areas there for the impact on that. So if we're going to be talking about 2045, it may be that we want to get into the transportation program a rebuilding of that road. Or there may be roads that need to be elevated, but they ought to be identified based on the modeling work that you're doing.
Yeah, but all you can do is kind of buy a little bit of time. I mean, it's in a long enough timeline, it's a done deal. There's communities that are going to be faced with a phased retreat, you could call it. So I don't know if that works into the model. I wanted to backtrack just real quick while I'm thinking about it, but it seems as if we spend so much time discussing like how are we going to grow responsibly and all of that, but we don't as much step back and say, well, how are we going to improve what we already have? How are we going to rejuvenate areas? You talk about bringing in technology jobs. I think that's very smart. Young professionals, bring them in. We've served on that steering committee for the Grove community in this district, Roberts district, and fingers crossed, hopefully there'll be some funding for widening those lanes. But man, could that area use more amenities? Could use a pool, nice bike paths for the kids, and maybe with that could come some of these jobs. So why not focus as much as we possibly can on what we already have, improve the quality of life? Because we know if we keep growing and expanding beyond the PSA, more and more neighborhoods, the quality of life quite simply goes down pretty quick when we are all stuck in traffic and ticked off all the time. So
It's a very good impact for building potential scenarios.
Because the flooding is probably pretty well understood, do you think that topics like sea level rise and resiliency is something that's people are going to kind of understand it, or do you think there's
people are in denial? I mean, I guess we're on local channel here. We don't have to discuss what's causing it, but it is happening. And I think I told you this a few meetings ago. I've very fortunate to live on a tidal creek for 40 years now, and we've had to raise the dock. And I was just meeting with the dock builder last week. They fully understand that it's coming up in Sewell's Point, Norfolk. The feds have been tracking it since the 30s. We're up 1.5 feet since the 1930s. You are not supposed to see this happen in a human lifetime. So these models going out to 2045, doom and gloom scenario, some of these communities will be, every time there's a storm flow, they're going under. And some of our communities further east, Norfolk being our major city further east, it's going to happen sooner. James City County, we're fortunate to have a lot of higher ground, but we do have roads that are going to go under and a few communities that will go under much more frequently and eventually all the way.
I think the issue that I'm looking for it's back to what do you do to mitigate some of these problems, okay? And they end up in your cumulative impact. They end up in your CIP program in terms of trying to fix it. So if you're going to try to keep the quality of life at some level, you need to make the investments in at least making sure it can stay there. Okay, and there are mitigation strategies that are available, and he's right, we're not as bad off. That's why I want to see it quantified as part of the resiliency factor that you have to look at to be able to have an idea. And the modeling can help us to quantify what those issues are, or at least get it from the staff so that it's visible, and it ends up being in the comp plan, EA1, go build a road.
I think it can help you quantify. Probably an important distinction that between things that differentiate scenarios versus things that apply to all scenarios. So something like sea level rise or recurrent flooding would apply equally to all scenarios.
So your transportation modeling is a factor.
It could be an output measure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Of if you assume that level of recurrent flooding or sea level rise or whatever, how does it affect different
transportation infrastructure for it? Yeah. So, for example, an emergency relief facility in this county is Lafayette High School, okay? It becomes a peninsula when it's flooded. So why would you want to put people in there?
Oops, good example.
Okay. Why would you want to use the rec center on Long Hill for an emergency place with all kind of glass in it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the questions, too, is if you have to commit large amounts of capital to raise roads and so forth, does that come out of your school capital program? Does it come out of your Parks and Rec capital program? Where do you get the capital? And if you're going to continue to grow and have storm mitigation problems,
it's a cumulative impact piece into the financial thing that needs to be plugged in as one of those factors. So that as you get down the road and it gets worse, you just plug it in and say, okay, these roads are all gone now.
The United Nations issued a report yesterday that projected a 3-foot rise at sea level in this century. And 3-foot rise going to make a lot of people unhappy.
It's going to be a mass movements of people, even in Virginia, with that.
You know what the effect is going to be on the county today for any one of those scenarios. The same thing with population by going and looking at the VIMS document.
Yep.
And as soon as we get some decent LiDAR data that's updated, we'll be able to know even better.
Yeah, I can connect you to those guys.
And the NOAA, maps that show the different scenarios of sea level rise and the impacts. But a point of reference for the regional modeling that is being done now for the HRPDC, they had a discussion among their working group, and they decided on the 3-foot sea level rise as kind of the baseline for their 2045 scenario. There's different assumptions, different scenarios, but just as a starting point, they're assuming, or they're not assuming, they're building into the model 3-foot.
Right. I've looked at 3-foot, 6-foot now to the VIMS model. You can get it by year on that. And it's really easy to see what the impact is going to be on the what infrastructure. Okay, so, we're getting ready to pour a lot of money into the Jamestown Marina to redo it because of this very reason. And so those are, once again, rationale for implementation decisions on why you want to do something.
Good points.
Yeah, sorry, we've kind of gone dark here, but it's pretty serious stuff with the environmental changes.
Did you want to share?
Aren't you glad you asked?
Dave hit on point. Especially, I live in the Grove community, and stormwater is a big issue for us. I mean, when it rains, it pours. My house and yard, use that as an example, it's flooded. And I've been dealing with that for years.
And what's even more worse about that area down there is there's still a lot of folks that are on septic. And so when it floods, those systems go down. And so the county's recent idea of being able to get assistance funding for septic systems within the county is another one of those step forwards on using somebody else's money to fix a problem about a now problem on quality of life.
So and that we do need to dig into the difference between sea level rise data and recurrent flooding data, which could be stormwater driven.
That's the problem for James City County.
Yes.
Because of the non-tidal nature of our terrain, period. Okay, and so when you get more days a year of over 1 inch, which is an Olympic pool, getting dumped at one time, and you think about the amount of rain we picked up, it chalks up to be a problem.
Great input. Yep.
Any other thoughts, opportunities, big ideas?
I wondered why we weren't having somebody from the economic development as part of this discussion group, and how do they plan? Because they're a solution.
Well, we partner with all of the major divisions in the county. Office of Economic Development is a big player in the economic development section and throughout. And so I think their input will be reflected as we continue to have discussions with them and look through each of these scenarios.
I was thinking about Robin Bloodsoe, who's been on the planning commissions with the economic development and has some ideas about the rural lands and how to do some things out there too. And I just think that she's a pretty valuable individual that has something to say, and that's the only reason I bring it up.
So ways to get economic potential out of the area without actually developing it in a traditional way.
Right. And she may have some ideas about the modeling of what you do for the rural lands that makes sense, that retains those sort of ideas. And it's not like we don't have a list of those things that have come out. How many different comp plans, Rich?
Yeah.
And only one of those things in there can we prevent by ordinance. All the rest of it is I wish we could.
Yeah, and a lot of this meeting is focused obviously on the modeling and building these scenarios, but questions more broad, opportunities in the process as a whole, public engagement and implementation and special studies that are needed, all that
And you have access, or have, I'm sure, reviewed the Rural Economic Development Committee report from, there was an outside consultant brought out, and it was a couple-year effort with the county. REDC was the group, but anyway, they were trying to come up with scenarios or strategies to avoid residential developments of rural lands, because everyone knows if push came to shove, one house per 3 acres. If a landowner got very frustrated, communal wells aside, with what's out there, and I understand the plight of the landowner if that was their 401k plan, if that 300 acres was their 401k to pass on to their heirs, and nobody wants to farm anymore. But the Red Sea report was very interesting, and I would recommend that at least executive summary to see what they were looking at, and they were trying to come up with strategies to use the rural lands for other than residential, but that would be an economic driver for the county.
Rich, you're going to fall over when I tell you this. Tom Hutchinson last week said, and he's part of the AFD with the rural area, is instead of 3 acres per lot, he says we got to make it 5 or 10.
For Right.
And that's one of the recommendations that was part of that report. And so there is a zoning scenario that says it goes from 3 to 5 and 10. What's the impact on that?
Oh, yeah,
And it's something that you'd want to find out from that community what the hell will they think.
Right.
And if they're in favor of that because they think it needs to be protected and all the rest of it, maybe we need to change it.
well, some will, some won't, and I mean, the local government has the power to make those changes. And
Well,
that's
it
how
used to
is.
be decades ago. It used to be one dwelling unit per acre in the rural lands, and then it was changed to what it is now, the 1 per 3. And from what I gather, it was before my arrival here 26 years ago. But from what I gather, it was hugely contentious.
Of course,
just to go from 1 to 3 acres.
Well, I think what you're going to find out when you look at this thing, if you look at the number of farms that are under 100 acres that are actually working, how many do you think they are?
handful.
57. And that's in the last comp plan. And so most of the land is in forestry. So I'm back to what is it we're trying to protect? And I'm hoping that the quantification of what we're talking about and the inputs to your model can at least show us what the impacts are or are not, based on some policy issues.
Yeah, and I think the having worked in James City County and other areas on the kind of rural economic development issues, those are critically important. Hard to quantify, but critically important. How do you quantify the value of having wineries and tourist experiences and things like that to your overall county economy versus an alternative? And at least the scenario planning allows you to compare alternatives. You can't necessarily quantify these, more nebulous things, but you can take a look at, see what if we went another direction away from, kind of wineries and more towards subdivisions or something like that. What would it look like, feel like? What would be the impacts on environmental things like that? I mean, it sounds like, without trying to presuppose, because we definitely need to get public input, it sounds like there will need to be some kind of scenario that looks at different approaches to the rural lands.
Right.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah,
Please.
that's huge.
Can you remind us of what the public engagement will look like? Is it open forum? Is it, how are we?
Yeah.
How are you guys doing that?
Yeah, so we have, at our last community participation team meeting, we talked about the public engagement process. And what we have is we've got our, just going to go back real quick to our 4 phases, just to kind of have it to guide me. Sorry, several slides here. But there we go. So we have it broken down into 4 phases. And so we're focusing the community participation team work within the phase that we're in, and then we'll kind of eventually start looking at the next phase as we make some good headway and listen and visit, which is our first phase. But each of these are set up somewhat similarly, but with slight differentiations, and definitely the focus on what we're trying to accomplish in each of those phases is we're building on the last phase, and we're working towards development of the actual plan and kind of taking it in chunks with the community to first focus on kind of their aspirations, concerns. How do we develop the vision and goals for the plans, the high level pieces, and getting some clarity about that in the first piece. Explore and test is where we start to take, and also as part of listen and vision is we'll want to get feedback from them to help inform us as we work with you all to develop the scenarios. We want to get some input from them to help understand what we want to be testing that we can kind of all collectively consider. And that's really the explore and test piece. And then decide and affirm is where we actually present back, here's what we think we are hearing from you in terms of the policy direction that you want to take as a community, building off the vision and goals, building off of what you said were your kind of reactions to these different scenarios. Here's where we think this is heading. You tell us if we've gotten it right or not before we go formalize a plan. And then the last piece is when we actually do the formalizing plan. Now, in terms of the actual activities and how we engage the community, there's a general framework for each of those. And it's a combination of what we call kind of centralized activities. So if you could think of a community workshop or an online activity, which you might argue is more decentralized, but then also having other activities that would kind of drive people to get to the workshop or to get to the online way of getting inputs from people. So we call them public intercept events, and they kind of generally fit into two buckets. One is like a community meeting, if you think about an HOA or a community organization, a civic organization, where you could go and educate people about the process and tell them about the opportunity to provide input. So it kind of has two prongs there. Or it's more of a community event. So if you have, a big community event where you're going to have lots of people, you can go set up a booth and have information, maybe get some, fairly limited engagement in that vehicle, because typically people are willing to stay for about 5 minutes tops, less than that, usually is a swing by kind of opportunity. But you can educate people about the process. And again, the call to action, which is, come to this workshop. If you can't make it, we're going to have this online opportunity. We really want to get your input. So it's driving to kind of a very tailored set of tools that we can use to get inputs from a lot of different people coming from different ways. Because what we've learned in public engagement is you can't just hold the workshop in the boardroom and expect everyone to come. It doesn't work anymore. And so we need to provide lots of different ways to do it. We're talking about doing some exciting things. So like with the workshop, we have a lot of technical details to work through, but one of the things we're talking about doing is televising it. So we'd have like a main place, and then we have other locations throughout the county where people could go to more localized centers. And then, there would be a way for people to maybe even might be delayed, but they might be able to watch from home and also participate too. So we're trying to find ways to kind of connect people in a variety of ways and make it easy for them.
Do you use any bait? And by that, I would prefer to and we did pretty well, Glenn, with some of the steering committee stuff with Grow Boat. I think we had, I don't know if we had pizza, I don't know if we went to that level, but do you have sometimes hey, there'll be free pizza or whatever, because, and that'll take more than hopefully 5 minutes to eat.
Food always drives people. If you have local celebrities, that's always a fun thing to kind of tap into. We had one community that had a famous basketball star, and we did the meeting in a gym, and lots of people came. So
okay. So be thinking like any kind of trick to get them to turn out.
I think that we want to create those opportunities. I think just we worked on the strategic plan effort in the past, and we had pretty good turnout in our public meetings. I think we also had. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think we had pretty good turnout online. And what we're finding in other communities working with comp plans is that more and more we're getting more input from the online than we are from the in-person. Sure. So particularly from, I would say, let's say 45 and below.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I went to those meetings, I was like the youngest one there.
Yeah.
So hopefully.
And then there's also that social media piece that you can tap into too to
Exactly.
drive them.
Yeah, and so on the communication side, so I've been focusing on the engagement and how we're going to, opportunities for us to educate and also get inputs from people that can feed into this bigger process. But then there's also kind of the communication channels. So we spent some time at our last meeting going through all of the different tools that we have and networks that we have to be kind of spreading the word and getting that branding in front of everybody so
Right.
everybody knows what it is and, you know, they can see it and understand what it is pretty quickly. And
People clearly care because the firm that did the county-wide survey, they got an incredible percentage in return. Can't remember what it was, but it was a lot.
Yeah.
More than I was
Yeah.
expecting. So it's on folks.
30%.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. I mean, and so it's on a lot of people's radar already because that's already gotten out there. So that's good.
And that's great that we have that to build off of, and it's pretty fresh. So that's something that we want to use. As we don't want to go back and ask those same questions. We want to build
Right.
off of what we learned from that.
Of course.
Does that
good.
help answer your
Yes,
question?
thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Anything else? Do we go to the cost?
This was very helpful.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Appreciate your input.
Are there no other items for discussion? Seeing none, a motion to adjourn.
So move.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all. It was great. Thank you. Well done.